A few pointers on Martin Heidegger's Introduction to Metaphysics, an interesting little book, later than Being in Time, a little bit shorter, rather a lot shorter in fact. Heidegger says there's a question we have to look at. It's the question, why are there beings at all instead of nothing? And he tells us this is the first of all questions. Now, it's not the first chronologically. It's the first in other respects. It's not the first one we ask, it's the first in importance. It's a question about beings as a whole. And so it's the broadest question, and it is also the deepest question. And it's the question we really need to grapple with. And Heidegger says we mean beings as a whole, without preference for any particular being. It's not a question about this stapler, or about this chess piece, or this chess piece. It's not a question about this pen, or this book, or about some other being, or about trees, or rocks, or fish, or elephants. It's not a question about all these beings individually. It's a question about the category that includes all of them and all the other beings. It's the question about all beings. We don't ask about any specific being, and yet one specific being keeps coming up when we look at this question, and that is the human being. If we properly pursue this question, we're not supposed to emphasize any being in particular, and yet when we ask about beings as a whole, a distinctive relation of that whole to humans emerges. This category of beings as a whole is, Heidegger says, first opened up as such by this questioning and by this questioner, the human being, or man, or what Heidegger calls Dasein, his word for the human being, the there being, Dasein. Here's a quote from Heidegger. If this question is posed, and provided that it is actually carried out, then this questioning necessarily recoils back from what is asked and what is interrogated back upon itself. Now, I remember reading this in undergrad and interpreting this in a strongly postmodern fashion, thinking Heidegger's saying, well, there is no reality out there, and so when the human mind comes along and asks the question, what is reality? It doesn't find anything there to ask about, but the question can turn back on itself and find itself, and thereby find that the question, what is reality, is itself the only reality there is to know. Well, it's not that kind of postmodernism, though it is a variety of postmodernism. It's not that exactly. I think what Heidegger is doing is not quite so extreme an anti-realism, but it is something like that. He's saying the reality is out there, the beings are out there, but the being with a capital B, as he said in Being in Time, or here the category of beings as a whole, is not a category that's out there until someone categorizes it. And we are the ones who categorize it. So when we ask this question about beings as a whole, the question does have to turn back on itself and encounter itself as the reason for the existence of this category of beings as a whole. The question encounters itself because the questioner, man, Dasein, the human being, seems to be the reason for the existence of the object of the question, which is the category of beings as a whole. Now, you may be a bit confused. Let me try to clear this up a bit. Here's the idea. Let me try to say it in different words. In Heidegger's book, Introduction to Metaphysics, he is introducing the big metaphysics question, why is there something rather than nothing? Or why are there beings rather than nothing at all? And he is telling us that this great question has a lot to do with us humans. It's a human question. And to ask the question is to learn that there is something metaphysically important about the questioner. Man, or Dasein, or the human being, is the being who is there asking the question. And we find out that the question is there, and that the very idea of being with a capital B is there because of us. Now, this again is, like in Being in Time, not exactly, at least not yet, a theory in metaphysics, but it's a way of studying metaphysics. It's a humanistic way of studying metaphysics. Now, let's look at some other aspects of the text. Heidegger tells us that this is a question for philosophy and not for religion. The proper asking of the question, he says, is a leap away from comfortable delusions and preconceptions, a leap into the question. He says genuine philosophy means asking this question. Christianity, he says, will not take that leap because Christianity presumes that God is the answer to the question. In Christianity, the question can be answered, but it cannot be asked. So Christian philosophy, he says, is a contradiction in terms, like a square circle. But Heidegger, not a Christian, will ask the question. Following the way he himself had set out in Being in Time, Heidegger will ask about being with a capital B, and he asks why there are beings rather than nothing, with attention to the importance that it is we humans who are asking the question. And he thinks we need to take the whole question seriously, and the question includes the phrase rather than nothing. Why are there beings at all rather than nothing? And Heidegger takes a position on the viability of talking about nothing. This is an old situation in philosophy. Not necessarily an unanswerable question, but at least an old puzzle that various philosophers have grappled with. Can you talk about nothing? And in what sense can you talk about nothing? Heidegger says you can talk about nothing. He thinks it makes sense to talk about nothing. And we have to talk about nothing if we're going to take seriously this question, why are there beings rather than nothing? Heidegger explains that science cannot talk seriously about nothing. But science does not control the limits of meaningful talk. Philosophy is foundational to science, and vice versa. Here I think Heidegger is staking out a position in resistance actually to the logical positivists in English-speaking philosophy. He, over on the continental side in German philosophy, doing philosophy in a very different way, is opposing the logical positivists and their scientism. Now, philosophy, he says, is a higher and a more spiritual way of thinking than science. Philosophy can ask questions about nothing. It can ask these hard questions and must ask these hard questions. And Heidegger tells us that there is something else that can go as high as philosophy, and that is poetry. He says only poetry is of the same order as philosophical thinking. So, let's overview a lot from this video and the last video about Heidegger. In Being in Time, we have a preface to a this-worldly and a humanistic metaphysics, and one which is attentive to time as the horizon of being, time as that which encloses all beings, and which particularly encloses us who shape the being of the beings in the world. And here in the Introduction to Metaphysics, we have a continuation of many or all of the same themes. Metaphysics is important, and a proper understanding of metaphysics will focus on human beings. And philosophy, although not science, can look at this sort of thing. And so can another great human endeavor, poetry. And I think this is probably a reason that the next Heidegger video in this channel will talk about a later text of Heidegger, which is very much more poetic than his earlier writings. Now, before getting to that, let's not only wait perhaps an extra week for a video on Sartre's Existentialism as a Humanism, but let's also say something about existentialism. Is Heidegger an existentialist? Well, that's a difficult question, and a lot of it depends on how exactly you define these terms. And basically, Sartre said Heidegger's an existentialist, and Heidegger said I'm not an existentialist, depending on how you mean these terms, because when you, Mr. Sartre, define the term existentialism, you use these words, existence and essence. And those are metaphysics words, Mr. Sartre. And I don't believe in metaphysics words until we have done metaphysics. And I don't believe in doing metaphysics until we've followed this path I've laid out in my own writings, in Being in Time and Introduction to Metaphysics. And so I'm not an existentialist. I don't think the word means anything. Not yet. Not until we figure out what being is. Not until we figure out why are there beings instead of nothing, and so on. But if we define the term in a certain way, Heidegger very clearly is an existentialist. If existentialism is the thesis, which it is, that existence precedes essence, and that essence is something we humans bring to the equation, then Heidegger is definitely a version of an existentialist, because he says the beings are out there, but their character as beings is shaped by us, at least in large part. And furthermore, the category of beings as a whole seems to be a product of our study, of our knowing of the world. We bring something, we the human beings, man Dasein, bring something to the world in our knowing of the world, which shapes the world and which determines the nature or the essence of the world. Although the terms in which existentialism is defined by Sartre are terms Heidegger is not prepared to use. In some crucial and important sense, Heidegger is both a humanist and an existentialist. But wait for the other videos to see more.